The
Any
enemy
snipers
commander
left?
raised his fist and
Yeah!
gave the order without a flicker of
They're
hesitation,
exposed.
kill the wounded
Did we lose
first.
them all?
Before Captain Daniel Brooks could even scream a warning, mortar rounds tore into the aid position, and men who couldn't even lift a rifle were thrown into the mud. That single order was the moment Bravo Company's world collapsed, and the moment that forced a girl nobody had bothered to notice to finally reveal who she really was. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe and stay with me until the very end, because this story is going to hit you harder than you expect. And drop a comment below telling me what city you are watching from tonight. I want to see how far this story travels. Captain Daniel Brooks had led men into fire before. He had watched friends die before. He thought he understood what the worst day of his career would feel like. He was wrong. The worst day started with silence, and silence was the one thing Brooks had learned never to trust. "Position's quiet," Sergeant Miller muttered beside him, scanning the ridge through his scope. "Too quiet." "Yeah," Brooks said. "I don't like it either." Bravo Company had been moving along the ridge for 6 hours, escorting a supply convoy through terrain that swallowed sound and hid everything. The mountains of eastern Afghanistan didn't just conceal the enemy, they seemed to breathe with them. Then the world exploded. The first RPG hit the lead vehicle and flipped it like a toy. Brooks was thrown sideways ears, screaming the taste of copper flooding his mouth. Gunfire erupted from 3 directions at once, not scattered, not panicked, but coordinated, disciplined. This wasn't some ragtag ambush. This was a trap, and Bravo Company had walked straight into the center of it. "Contact left, contact right," someone screamed. "Get down, get down." Brooks rolled behind a boulder, blood running down the side of his face from a gash he didn't remember getting. He grabbed his radio. "Overwatch, this is Bravo 6. We are pinned down, I say again. We are pinned down, requesting immediate air support." "Static," he tried again. "Overwatch, do you copy? Overwatch." Nothing but a dead hiss. Corporal Reyes crawled to him, face pale. "Sir, comms are gone. The tower took a direct hit. We got nothing." Brooks felt something cold settle into his stomach, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. Isolation. Real isolation in the middle of a war zone with dozens of enemy fighters closing in and no way to call for help. "Then we fight with what we have," Brooks said, forcing his voice steady even as his hands shook. "Fall back to the ridgeline, defensive position now." The soldiers scrambled, dragging wounded men behind broken rock and shattered vehicle frames. Bullets chewed the dirt at their heels. Private Alvarez went down screaming, clutching his leg, and 2 men dragged him the last 20 feet under fire, while Brooks laid down covering fire until his weapon clicked empty. For a moment, just a moment, Brooks thought they might hold. Then the mortar started. The first round landed short, the second landed closer, and the third slammed directly into the makeshift aid station where the medic Doc Ferris was working on Alvarez's leg. Brooks watched it happen in slow motion. The explosion, the dirt and smoke, Ferris thrown backward, not moving, Alvarez screaming a scream that wasn't human anymore. "Medic down! Medic down! They're targeting the wounded!" Miller shouted, disbelief cracking his voice. "Sir, they're targeting the wounded!" Through the smoke, on a distant rise, Brooks caught a glimpse of the man directing the assault. A broad-shouldered enemy commander in a dark jacket, binoculars, raised arm extended, pointing directly at their position. Brooks watched him lower the binoculars, turn to a subordinate, and give another order without a trace of hesitation on his face. Seconds later, another mortar found its mark. "He's doing this on purpose," Brooks said, more to himself than anyone. "He wants to break us before he even sends men in." "Sir, what do we do?" Reyes shouted over the chaos. Brooks didn't answer right away because for the first time in his career, he genuinely did not know. His platoon had riflemen. Good ones. They had 2 machine gunners doing everything humanly possible to keep the enemy's heads down. They had grit, they had discipline, they had each other. What they did not have was reach. They did not have the one thing that could stop a commander 400 meters back from calmly ordering death after death after death. They had no sniper. Brooks pressed his back against the rock, chest heaving, and looked at the faces around him. Young faces, scared faces, faces that trusted him to have an answer. He didn't. Another mortar impact threw dirt over all of them. Someone was crying out for their mother in a voice too broken to sound like a grown man. The enemy fire wasn't slowing. If anything, it was tightening, squeezing them like a fist. Brooks made a decision he knew was probably useless, but useless was better than nothing. He stood halfway up, ignoring Miller's hand grabbing at his vest to pull him back down, and he shouted across the position with everything he had left in his lungs. "Any snipers here?" The words hung in the air, swallowed almost instantly by gunfire. Nobody answered. Brooks felt his chest tighten. He'd known it was a long shot. Bravo Company was a standard infantry unit. Snipers were attached from specialized teams, and theirs had been reassigned 2 weeks earlier and never replaced. He'd known the answer before he asked the question, but some small, desperate part of him had hoped anyway. "Sir, get down!" Reyes screamed, yanking him by the arm as rounds cracked past his head. Brooks dropped back behind the rock, breathing hard, and for the first time that day, something like despair crept into his throat. Then he heard it, a voice, quiet, almost lost beneath the noise of war, but steady in a way nothing else around him was steady. "Sir, I am." Brooks turned so fast he nearly lost his footing on the loose rock. Every head near him turned too. Standing a few feet back, half crouched behind a supply crate, was Private Emily Carter. For a moment, nobody said anything, because for a moment, nobody could quite process what they were looking at. Emily Carter was not a name anyone in Bravo Company knew well. She had transferred in 5 days earlier, assigned to logistics and equipment maintenance. She was quiet to the point of being invisible. She ate alone. She spoke only when spoken to. In 5 days, Brooks could count on one hand the number of times he'd heard her voice at all. Miller actually laughed a short, disbelieving bark, completely out of place in the middle of a firefight. "Carter, you're a supply clerk." "I didn't ask what her job title was," Brooks snapped through. Even he couldn't fully hide the disbelief in his own voice. "Carter, what did you just say?" Emily didn't flinch at the gunfire snapping over the crate beside her. She didn't flinch at Miller's laugh either. Her eyes were fixed on Brooks, calm in a way that felt almost wrong given everything happening around them. "I said I am, sir," she repeated. "A sniper." "Based on what?" Miller demanded. "You've been organizing crates for 5 days, Carter. This isn't the time to—" Miller, Brooks cut him off, holding up a hand because something in Emily's stillness had caught his attention in a way her words alone hadn't. Everyone else on that ridge was moving, flinching, ducking, shaking. Emily was the only person completely unnervingly still. She reached behind her and unclipped a long equipment bag that Brooks had genuinely assumed for 5 days contained tent poles or radio equipment. She unzipped it. Brooks's breath caught. Nestled inside, wrapped in careful padding, secured with a precision that spoke of habit rather than regulation, was a rifle. Not standard issue. A customized long-range system, the kind of weapon Brooks had only ever seen in the hands of soldiers from very specific, very quiet units whose names most people in the regular army weren't cleared to know. "That's an M2010, Reyes breathed, staring. "Where the hell did a logistics specialist get an M2010? Emily didn't answer that question. She lifted the weapon out with both hands, movements economical, practiced, nothing like the fumbling grip of someone handling something unfamiliar. Brooks stared at her, and in that moment he saw something shift in her face. The nervous, downward-glancing woman who avoided eye contact in the mess hall was gone. In her place was someone else entirely, someone whose eyes had gone flat and focused, someone whose hands had stopped shaking the moment they touched cold steel. "Who are you?" Brooks asked, quieter now, almost lost beneath the chaos. Emily looked past him, out toward the smoke and the ridge, and the enemy commander still directing death from 400 meters away. "Someone who can keep your people alive," she said. "If you let me." Another mortar round slammed down 30 meters to their left. Someone screamed. Brooks didn't have the luxury of doubt anymore. "Do it," he said. "Whatever you are, whoever you are, do it now." Emily nodded once and moved. She didn't crawl toward a random gap in the rocks. She moved with immediate, deliberate purpose toward a specific outcrop. Brooks hadn't even considered a slight rise with a narrow but clear sightline down the length of the enemy position. She dropped into position like she had scouted the spot hours earlier instead of seconds. "Miller, get eyes on her position, cover her," Brooks ordered, and for once Miller didn't argue. He just stared at Emily settling behind the rifle and moved. Emily pressed her cheek to the stock. Her breathing, which Brooks could somehow hear even over the gunfire, began to slow. In, out, each breath longer than the last, each one more controlled, until her chest barely seemed to move at all. Brooks had seen combat veterans lose their composure under fire. He had seen hardened men shake freeze break. He had never seen anyone go this still. "Talk to me, Carter," Brooks said, crouching beside her own. "What do you see?" "Enemy sniper," Emily said, voice flat and clear. "Tree line, 11 o'clock, approximately 900 meters." Brooks yanked his binoculars up and scanned the tree line. Green, brown, shadow, nothing. "I don't see anything." "He's there," Emily said. "Carter, I need to know your sir." Her voice didn't rise, didn't sharpen, but something in it made Brooks stop talking immediately. "He's there." A long beat passed. Gunfire cracked around them. Somewhere behind, another wounded man screamed for a medic that was already dead. Emily exhaled. The shot cracked out sharp and singular against the chaos almost lost in it, except it wasn't lost at all. Because a heartbeat later, the enemy sniper's rifle fire that had been pinning down the eastern flank simply stopped. Silence from that direction for the first time in 20 minutes. "Confirmed kill," Emily said, already shifting her aim voice utterly without emotion, like she was reading off a supply manifest instead of announcing she had just ended a man's life at 900 meters in a windstorm. Brooks stared at her. Miller stared at her. Even Reyes, half dragging another wounded man toward cover, froze for half a second. "Holy hell," Miller whispered. There was no time to process it. Emily was already tracking a new target. "Machine gun position northeast elevated. They're the ones cutting off our southern flank." "Take it," Brooks said, and this time there was no hesitation in his voice at all. Another breath, another shot, another silence where deadly noise had been. The machine gun position went quiet. "They're going to reposition," Emily said, already adjusting. "Give me 30 seconds." Brooks watched stunned as a woman he had dismissed 5 days ago as a quiet, unremarkable supply clerk methodically, calmly dismantled an entrenched enemy assault piece by piece. She wasn't just shooting. She was reading the battlefield the way Brooks had spent 15 years learning to read it, except she was doing it faster, cleaner, with a precision that made his own instincts feel clumsy by comparison. "Communications team 300 meters behind the collapsed wall," Emily said next. "Confirmed," Reyes shouted from a different vantage point, having caught sight of the same position through his scope. "How the hell did you spot that from here?" The shot answered his question before Emily could. One of the enemy's radio operators dropped, and the flow of coordinated orders that had made this ambush so devastating suddenly stuttered. Brooks felt something shift in the battle, something he could feel in his chest before he could fully articulate it in his mind. The enemy fire, which had been tight and disciplined and terrifying for the last 20 minutes, was beginning to fray at the edges. Radio silence on their side, confusion in their movements, a sniper suddenly missing from their support, a machine gun position gone quiet. "They don't know what's happening to them," Miller said, disbelief creeping into something close to hope. "They will," Emily said quietly, already shifting again. "Squad advancing southern approach, 12 men moving to flank. They'll be in grenade range in 90 seconds if I don't stop them." "Do it," Brooks said. Emily didn't waste a single motion. Shot, adjust, shot. 2 men down in the advancing squad and the rest scattered for cover, their coordinated advance broken into panic disorder. Brooks realized watching her that something had fundamentally changed about the fight. Bravo Company was no longer simply trying to survive. For the first time since the ambush began, they were fighting back with purpose, with direction, because Emily Carter was giving them exactly that. But even as the tide shifted, Brooks couldn't shake the questions clawing at the back of his mind. How did a woman assigned to logistics 5 days ago have this level of skill? Not just marksmanship, anyone could be taught to shoot straight. This was something else. This was instinct. This was a mind that read distance and wind and human behavior the way most people read a sentence. Where had Emily Carter learned to do this? And why, if she could do this, had she been hiding in a supply tent instead? There was no time to ask, because just as the enemy's assault seemed to be faltering, the mountainside lit up with a new and terrible sound, heavier engines grinding gears, the unmistakable rumble of armored vehicles moving up from the rear. "Sir," Reyes shouted, voice cracking with alarm. "Vehicles incoming, Southern Ridge. I count at least 2, maybe 3. Brooks's stomach dropped. Bravo Company had no anti-armor capability left. Their one AT specialist had gone down in the opening minutes of the ambush. "Carter." "I see them," Emily said, already tracking, jaw tightening, for the first time since she'd picked up the rifle. This was different. A sniper rifle, even an exceptional one in exceptional hands, wasn't built to stop armor. What do we do? Miller asked, looking between Brooks and Emily with something close to panic. For a long moment, Emily didn't answer. Her eyes stayed pressed to the scope, calculating, and Brooks watched something flicker across her face. Not fear exactly, but the specific, focused strain of someone doing very fast, very difficult math, with lives hanging on the answer. Their commander, she said finally, the one giving orders. He's riding in the lead vehicle. If I can get a shot on him before they're in range, it buys us time. Maybe enough to fall back. That's a moving target inside a vehicle at, 600 meters in closing, Miller said. That's not a shot, Carter, that's a miracle. I know, Emily said quietly. Brooks looked at her, and for the first time since she'd revealed herself, he saw a flicker of the same uncertain private woman he remembered from the mess hall, gone in an instant, replaced again by the same terrifying stillness. Carter, Brooks said, if you don't think you can make it. I can make it, she said. Her voice didn't waver, but something underneath it did. I have to. Before Brooks could say anything else, the lead vehicle's hatch popped open, and the enemy commander, the same broad-shouldered man who had ordered the mortar strike on their wounded, rose partway out to survey the battlefield through his binoculars. Emily's breathing slowed to something almost inhuman. In, hold, out. Everyone get down, Brooks said quietly, some instinct telling him that whatever happened in the next 3 seconds would decide everything. The shot cracked out across the ridge like the end of the world. For a full second, nothing happened, and Brooks felt his heart stop with it, certain the shot had missed, certain they had gambled everything on an impossible angle and lost. Then the commander crumpled backward into the vehicle, and the lead vehicle lurched to a sudden, chaotic stop. Absolute silence swept across the enemy position, the kind of silence that meant confusion, that meant a chain of command had just been violently severed. Confirmed kill, Emily said, and this time Brooks heard something crack faintly beneath the flat professionalism of her voice. Not triumph, something closer to grief. The remaining vehicles slowed, uncertain, their advance stalling as officers scrambled to re-establish control without their commander's direction. They're pulling back, Reyes shouted, disbelief lighting his voice. Sir, they're actually pulling back. A ragged, exhausted cheer went up. From what remained of Bravo Company, not celebration, not yet, but something closer to relief so intense it nearly broke men who hadn't cried since basic training. Brooks let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for 20 minutes straight. He looked at Emily, who hadn't moved from her position rifle, still trained on the retreating enemy, line body still locked in the same impossible stillness. Carter, he said, you just saved this entire platoon. Emily didn't answer right away. When she finally lowered the rifle, her hands steady through every single shot through 900 meters in impossible angles, and a moving target under fire were shaking. Brooks noticed it immediately. Hey, Carter, you all right? I'm fine, sir, she said too quickly. That wasn't luck back there, Miller said, staring at her with something between awe and unease. Nobody just happens to be able to do what you just did. Not with skills like that. Not with a rifle like that. Emily didn't respond to him. Her eyes were fixed somewhere distant, somewhere that had nothing to do with the retreating enemy vehicles or the ridge or the men around her. Brooks crouched down in front of her, lowering his voice so only she could hear it beneath the chaos of soldiers reorganizing, checking wounded, calling out head counts. Carter, look at me. Slowly she did. You are not just a sniper, Brooks said quietly. I've commanded men for 15 years. I know the difference between someone who's trained and someone who's been through something. You weren't just trained for this. You were built for it, and something happened that made you stop. Emily's jaw tightened. For a moment, Brooks thought she wasn't going to answer at all. Not now, sir, she said finally, voice barely above a whisper. Please. Brooks studied her for a long moment, the woman who had just single-handedly turned the worst ambush of his career into a fighting retreat, the woman whose hands trembled not from fear of the enemy, but from something buried far deeper than that. He nodded slowly. All right, not now. But even as Bravo Company began the grim work of gathering their wounded and preparing to move off the ridge before the enemy could regroup, Brooks couldn't shake the feeling that whatever Emily Carter was running from was far from finished with her. Because 500 meters down the valley, hidden in the smoke, in the confusion of a retreat that had come far too close to becoming a slaughter, radios were already crackling to life with a very different kind of order. The enemy hadn't just lost a commander. They had lost him to a single shot from a position that should have been impossible, fired by a soldier that should not have existed. And somewhere in that chain of command, scrambling to regroup, a very different voice was already asking a very dangerous question. Who was the shooter? Brooks didn't know it yet, moving through the wreckage of the ambush site, calling out orders, checking on his wounded, throwing glances every few seconds at the quiet woman walking a few paces behind him with a rifle case slung over her shoulder like it weighed nothing at all. But the girl nobody had noticed 5 days ago had just made herself impossible to ignore, not only to the men she'd saved, but to the enemies she'd just humiliated. And somewhere in her own memory, behind eyes that stared at nothing, Emily Carter was fighting a battle that had nothing to do with the retreating soldiers below the ridge. Because the last time she had held a rifle like this one, with a battle collapsing around her and lives hanging on every decision she had frozen, and someone she loved had paid the price. As the platoon began the long, exhausted march away from the ridge, dragging their wounded, carrying their dead, Brooks fell into step beside her one more time. "We're not done talking about this," he said quietly. Emily didn't look at him. She kept walking, rifle case steady on her shoulder, eyes fixed straight ahead on a horizon that seemed to hold something only she could see. "I know," she said. And somewhere behind them, in the smoke still curling up from a battlefield that had nearly buried them all, the enemy was already regrouping, not to retreat, but to find out exactly who had turned their perfect ambush into a disaster. They wanted a name. They wanted to know who the shooter was. And when they found out, the war on that mountain was only going to get worse. The retreat down the ridge was not a retreat anyone would have called orderly. Bravo Company moved in staggered clusters through smoke and loose scree, dragging wounded men on makeshift litters made from ponchos and rifle slings every step, shadowed by the fear that the enemy hadn't actually pulled back, only regrouped. Brooks kept close to the center of the formation, radio pressed to his ear, working the same dead frequency over and over out of pure stubbornness. "Overwatch, this is Bravo 6 radio, check over." Static. "Overwatch, do you copy, over?" Static. He clenched his jaw and clipped the radio back to his vest. 6 minutes into the withdrawal, and already his mind kept drifting back to the ridge, to the sound of that single shot that had dropped an enemy commander from a moving vehicle at 600 meters. He glanced over his shoulder. Emily Carter walked near the rear of the column rifle case slung across her back, eyes constantly moving, not nervously but methodically, sweeping the tree lines, the rock formations, the dead ground where an ambush could hide. She looked, Brooks thought, like someone who had done this exact walk 100 times before. Someone who trusted nothing and no one until it proved itself safe. "Carter," Brooks said, dropping back to walk beside her. "How you holding up?" "Fine, sir." "You don't have to keep saying that." Emily's eyes flicked to him, then back to the terrain. "What do you want me to say instead?" Brooks almost smiled despite everything. There was something painfully honest in the bluntness of it. The truth would be a start. She didn't answer that. Up ahead, Reyes was helping carry Alvarez's litter, the young private drifting in and out of consciousness, blood soaking through the field, dressing on his leg faster than it should have been. "He's losing too much blood," Reyes called back, voice tight with panic. "Doc's gone, sir. I don't know what to do. He's losing too much." "Set him down," Emily said immediately, already moving. "You're not a medic," Miller snapped, falling in behind her, still wary, still unconvinced by everything he'd watched her do an hour or earlier. "No," Emily agreed, crouching beside Alvarez and ripping open the dressing with fast, practiced hands. "But I've packed enough wounds in the field to know Doc's dressing was too loose. Someone hold his leg still." Miller hesitated only a second before dropping down to help. Emily's hands moved fast, cutting packing, wrapping, applying pressure, with a precision that felt disturbingly familiar to the same precision she'd shown behind a rifle scope less than an hour before. Alvarez groaned, eyes fluttering open. "Stay with me," Emily said, voice low, steady, almost gentle, in a way nobody in Bravo Company had heard from her yet. "You're not dying today, not on my watch." Who are you?" Alvarez slurred. "Someone who's seen worse than this," Emily said. "Now shut up and breathe." The bleeding slowed, not stopped, but slowed enough to buy time. Brooks exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Good," he said quietly. "Good work." "We need to keep moving," Emily said, already standing, scanning the terrain again. "Standing still this long is how people die out here." As if summoned by the words, a single shot cracked from somewhere in the rocks above them. The round hit inches from Reyes's boot, sending up a spray of gravel. Everyone dropped instantly. "Sniper!" Miller screamed. "They've got a shooter on the high ground!" Chaos surged back into the column. Men scattered for whatever cover the terrain offered. A boulder, here a shallow depression there, while a second shot cracked out, this one grazing the litter Alvarez had just been carried away from. "They found us," Brooks growled, pressing himself flat behind a rock outcrop. "They're not falling back. They're hunting." Emily was already moving low and fast, rifle coming off her shoulder in one fluid motion. "Carter, where? Give me an angle," she said, cutting him off, sliding into a shallow crevice that offered a narrow line of sight back up toward the ridge they'd just abandoned. "I need eyes on the shooter." "You can't see him from there. It's too far back." "I don't need to see him," Emily said, already settling the rifle, breath already slowing into that same terrifying stillness. "I need to see where the shots are coming from." "There's a difference." Another round cracked out, and this time it clipped the shoulder of a young private named Dawson, spinning him sideways with a scream. Men shouted. Someone returned wild, undisciplined fire toward the ridge, hitting nothing but rock. "Hold your fire," Brooks bellowed. "You're wasting rounds. We don't know where he is." "I know where he is," Emily said quietly. Brooks turned. "What?" Muzzle flash pattern, elevation, the delay between shot and impact. Her eyes never left the scope. "He's using a bolt action, probably a Dragunov variant, and he's smart. He's shifted position after every shot. But he has a pattern, right to left. He thinks it makes him harder to predict." "Does it? Not to me." Brooks felt something in his chest tighten with a strange, unfamiliar hope. "How long until he fires again?" 15 seconds, Emily said. "Maybe less." Nobody breathed. 10 seconds passed in silence, broken only by wounded men's ragged breath and the distant wind moving through rock. Then, exactly as Emily predicted, motion flickered near a cluster of boulders 200 meters up the slope. Barely visible, a shift of shadow that most eyes would have dismissed as nothing. Emily fired. There was no scream, no confirmation, nothing but the abrupt, absolute absence of another shot. Seconds stretched into a full minute. No return fire came. "Confirmed kill," Emily said, voice flat, already scanning for a second threat that mercifully didn't materialize. Miller stared at her, something shifting behind his eyes, not just awe now, but a kind of unease that came from watching someone do something no ordinary human being should be able to do. "That's twice," he said quietly. "Twice you have called an impossible shot before you even had a target confirmed." "Would you rather I guessed?" Emily said, lowering the rifle. "I'd rather understand how a supply clerk sees things like that." Emily didn't answer. She turned and kept walking, and after a beat, the rest of the column fell in behind her, because at this point, nobody was questioning who was actually leading them off that mountain anymore. Brooks caught up beside her again, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "That wasn't guesswork back there. That was recognition. You've fought someone like that before, haven't you? You knew his pattern because you've seen it." Emily's jaw tightened, the same tell Brooks had noticed on the ridge. "Sir, I really think—" "I'm not asking as your commanding officer right now," Brooks said. "I'm asking as a man who watched you save 4 of my soldiers' lives in the last 90 minutes. I think I've earned a straight answer." Emily was quiet for a long moment, boots crunching over loose rock, eyes fixed on the horizon. "There's a training doctrine," she said finally, voice careful, controlled. "Certain counter-sniper units are taught patterned movement to avoid predictability. I was taught to recognize it because I was taught to break it." "Taught where?" "Not now, sir." "Carter." "Please," Emily said, in something in the single word, not defiance, not evasion, but something closer to genuine pain, made Brooks stop pushing. For now. 19 minutes later, the column reached a collapsed stone structure that might once have been a herder's shelter wall, still mostly intact, offering the first real cover they'd had since the ambush began. Brooks called the halt. "We hold here," he said. "Get the wounded inside post security on all approaches. Reyes, try the radio again." "On it, sir." While the platoon fortified the position, Brooks pulled Miller aside. "I want your honest read," Brooks said quietly. "Not about her skill, about her state of mind." Miller glanced back toward where Emily was helping reposition Alvarez against the stone wall, checking his dressing again with the same quiet efficiency. "She's holding it together," Miller admitted. "But sir, I don't think she's holding it together because she's fine. I think she's holding it together because she's terrified of what happens if she stops." Brooks nodded slowly. He'd seen that particular kind of discipline before, the kind built not from confidence, but from necessity, the kind that came from someone who had learned somewhere that falling apart cost lives. "Sir," Reyes called from near the entrance, radio pressed to his ear, static crackling audibly even from a distance. "I've got something, weak signal, but I've got something on." Brooks rushed over, snatching the handset. "Overwatch, this is Bravo 6. Do you copy? Over." Through a wash of static, a distorted voice broke through. "Bravo 6. This is Overwatch. Say again, status. We are danger close, multiple wounded comms, and air support were down. We need immediate extraction. I say again, immediate extraction." The response came back fractured, cutting in and out. "Unable to reach your position before nightfall, nearest QRF, 6 hours out. Hold position." Brooks's stomach dropped. 6 hours, we have wounded. Who won't survive 6 hours? Do what you can. Overwatch out." The line went dead again. Brooks stood frozen for a long moment, radio still gripped in his fist, the weight of 6 hours settling over him like a physical thing. "Sir," Reyes asked, voice small. "Reinforcements are 6 hours out," Brooks said, forcing the words out evenly, even as something inside him screamed, "We hold this position until then." Across the shelter, Emily looked up from Alvarez's side, and for just a moment, her carefully composed expression cracked not into panic, but into something that looked almost like recognition. Like she had heard those exact words before in a different place with a different outcome. Brooks noticed it. He filed it away. There would be time for questions later. Right now, there was only survival. 40 minutes into the standoff, with the sun beginning its slow slide toward the western ridgeline, the first sign of the enemy's return came not as gunfire, but as something far more unsettling. A voice. A radio not theirs, crackling faintly on a frequency Reyes had accidentally intercepted while trying to boost their own weak signal. Confirmed target identification. The American shooter. Designation unclear. Command wants confirmation before further engagement. Brooks froze. "Wait, play that back." Reyes adjusted the dial with shaking fingers, and the voice returned clearer, this time speaking accented, but competent English, clearly aware that intercepted communications sometimes needed to be understood by the enemy for maximum psychological effect. "All units be advised, the shooter responsible for Commander Farouk's death is confirmed, female confirmed, skilled beyond standard training. Command believes this may be the operative known previously as..." The transmission cut sharply, replaced by static. Every head in the shelter turned toward Emily. Her face had gone pale, jaw locked, eyes wide, with something that looked for the very first time since Brooks had met her like genuine fear. "Carter," Brooks said slowly. "What were they about to say?" "I don't know," Emily said, too fast, too flat. "That's not true, and we both know it," Brooks said, stepping closer. "They know who you are. They recognized your work back there, didn't they? That wasn't a lucky guess about a Dragunov's firing pattern. You fought people connected to this network before." Emily's hands, Brooks noticed, had curled into fists at her sides. "Sir, with respect," she said, voice tight. "Right now, the question of who I used to be doesn't matter half as much as the question of who's coming for us in the next 6 hours. It matters if it puts my platoon in more danger," Brooks said, his voice hardening. "If you have a history with these people, a real history, not just training doctrine, I need to know now, not after it costs someone their life." Emily was silent for a long, agonizing moment. Then from outside the shelter, a new sound cut through the tension, the low, distant thrum of rotor blades. Not friendly, not American. "Chopper!" Miller barked, scrambling to a firing position near the collapsed doorway, inbound southwest. "Everybody down now!" Brooks shouted. The helicopter, an old but functional Mi-17 clearly repurposed by hostile forces, swept low over the ridge, and Brooks caught a glimpse of a door gunner readying a mounted weapon. "They're going to strafe the position," Reyes shouted. Emily moved before anyone else could react, snatching up her rifle and sprinting toward a gap in the collapsed wall that offered the only possible angle on the aircraft. "Carter, that's a helicopter. You can't..." "I can hit the pilot's canopy," Emily said, already dropping into position. Voice steady despite everything Brooks had just watched crack in her seconds earlier. "It's glass, not armor. If I can rattle him, force an evasive maneuver, he loses his gun run. That's an impossible shot on a moving aircraft." I know, Emily said. I've made it before. The helicopter banked, beginning its strafing run, machine gun fire already chattering to life from the door gunner's position, chewing up the earth in a line racing toward the shelter. Emily fired. The round found the cockpit glass in a spray of shattering fragments. The pilot jerked violently, the aircraft lurching sideways in an uncontrolled bank that sent the gun run wild rounds, tearing harmlessly into empty rock instead of the shelter. The helicopter peeled away, smoke trailing faintly from somewhere near the engine housing, disappearing back over the ridge in a retreat that was clearly more emergency than tactical withdrawal. Silence fell over the shelter, broken only by ragged breathing and the fading thrum of damaged rotors. Confirmed hit, Emily said, voice barely above a whisper, hands finally visibly shaking as she lowered the rifle. Brooks stared at her chest, heaving adrenaline and disbelief warring in equal measure. That's 3, he said. 3 impossible shots in under 2 hours. Emily didn't answer. She was staring down at her own trembling hands like they belonged to someone else. Miller approached slowly, something in his expression finally shifting from suspicion into something closer to shame. Carter, I owe you an apology. I doubted you back there, and you've done nothing but— Don't, Emily said quietly, cutting him off, though there was no anger in it. Don't thank me yet. This isn't over. That radio transmission— She stopped herself. Finish it, Brooks said gently. Emily closed her eyes for a moment. If they think I'm who I believe they think I am, she said finally, then this isn't a normal enemy unit anymore. This is personal for them. And they will not stop sending people until either I'm dead or every single one of you is. The words landed like a physical weight across the small shelter. Then tell us what we're dealing with, Brooks said. Please, Carter. I can't protect my men from a threat I don't understand. Emily opened her eyes, and for the first time, something in her posture seemed to genuinely break, not into panic, but into exhaustion, into the visible weight of carrying something alone for far too long. 3 years ago, she began slowly, I was part of a program most people were never supposed to know existed. We called it Sentinel Division. High-value precision operations, deniable off the books. I was young. I was good. Maybe too good, because they kept sending me on missions most operators wouldn't survive their first year of. And this enemy, Brooks said carefully, you crossed paths with them during that time. Their leadership, Emily said. Some of the men we're fighting today, the network we walked into on this ridge, it isn't new to me. 3 years ago, my unit was sent to eliminate a weapons network operating in this exact region. We succeeded. Mostly. Her voice caught just slightly on the last word. But it cost us. It cost me someone I loved. Who? Brooks asked quietly. Emily looked away toward the entrance of the shelter, toward the darkening ridgeline, where smoke from the downed helicopter's near miss still curled faintly into the evening sky. Her name was Hannah, Emily said, voice dropping to something raw and unguarded. Sergeant Hannah Reed. She was my spotter, my mentor, the only person who ever made me believe I was more than just a weapon they'd built out of a scared 19-year-old girl. Brooks felt the shelter go completely silent, every soldier within earshot suddenly unmistakably listening. What happened to her? He asked. Emily's hands curled into fists again, this time not from adrenaline, but from something far older and far heavier. I froze, she said. For 3 seconds in the middle of an extraction that was falling apart around us, I froze, and those 3 seconds were long enough. Nobody spoke. The wind outside picked up hissing, faintly through the broken stone. I left the program after that, Emily continued. I requested reassignment to the most invisible job I could find. Logistics, supply. Somewhere I couldn't be responsible for anyone's life again, except cargo manifests and equipment inventories. She let out a short, humorless breath. Apparently the universe had other plans. Brooks studied her for a long moment, seeing her now not as the quiet supply clerk from 5 days ago, and not entirely as the impossibly skilled shooter who had saved his platoon 3 times in a single afternoon, but as someone caught painfully between both, someone still fighting a war that had never actually ended for her, 3 years and thousands of miles away from where it started. Carter, he said finally gently, none of what happened to Hannah is happening again today. You haven't frozen once, not for a second. Not yet, Emily said quietly. Before Brooks could respond, Reyes's voice cracked through the tense silence, sharp with alarm. Sir, movement north ridge, I count. He adjusted his scope, voice rising with each word. I count at least 20, maybe 30 hostiles moving in formation, and sir, he stopped swallowing hard. They've got a designated marksman team, multiple scoped rifles. They're not advancing like regular infantry. This looks organized, coordinated, like they know exactly what they're walking into. Brooks's blood ran cold. They're not sending soldiers, they're sending a counter-sniper element. Emily was already moving toward the firing position, rifle rising, face hardening back into that same terrifying stillness. But Brooks caught something new in her eyes this time. Not just focus, recognition. "Carter," he said, "talk to me. What are we looking at?" Emily's breath caught just slightly as she settled behind the scope and adjusted focus on the approaching formation. "Oh God," she whispered. "Carter." "That formation," Emily said, voice suddenly unsteady, in a way it hadn't been through helicopters, mortars, or moving vehicles. "That exact spacing, that positioning, I've seen it before. I trained men to move like that." Brooks felt ice settle into his chest. "What are you saying?" Emily lowered the scope for just a moment, staring out at the distant formation, with an expression caught somewhere between disbelief and dread. "I'm saying somebody out there learned from the same playbook I did," she said. "And if I'm right about who's leading that team, sir, then we are not facing random insurgents anymore." "Then who are we facing?" Brooks demanded. Emily's jaw tightened, her eyes fixed on the darkening ridge where 30 armed men were closing the distance with terrifying, practiced precision. "Someone who was there 3 years ago," she said. "Someone who watched me freeze and has spent every day since then waiting for the chance to make me pay for it." The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint, unmistakable crack of a single ranging shot fired from somewhere on the approaching ridge, not aimed to hit, but aimed to announce. A message. Emily's hands, Brooks noticed with a chill he couldn't shake, had finally completely stopped shaking. Because whatever fear had lived in her only moments before had just been replaced by something else entirely, something colder, older, and far more dangerous. "Sir," she said quietly, eyes never leaving the scope, "get everyone who can't fight behind the deepest cover you have, because in about 4 minutes, this shelter is going to become the most dangerous place on this mountain." Brooks didn't hesitate. He turned and began shouting orders, dragging wounded men deeper into the shelter's collapsed remains, positioning what few able-bodied soldiers remained along every possible line of defense. But even as he moved, even as the platoon scrambled to prepare for whatever was about to hit them, one thought lodged itself in his mind and refused to let go. Emily Carter hadn't just stumbled into this ambush. Somehow, some way, this fight had been waiting for her all along. And on the ridge above them, 30 armed men were closing in. Led, Brooks was now certain by someone who knew exactly who Emily Carter used to be and exactly what it would take to break her all over again. The first shot from the approaching formation cracked out through the darkening sky, and this time it wasn't a warning. The first shot from the ridge didn't hit anyone. It didn't need to. It was a message, and every soldier crouched behind the broken stone shelter understood exactly what it meant. They know we're here. They know who's shooting, and they are not afraid. "Positions!" Brooks roared, dragging Dawson's wounded body deeper into the shelter's collapsed interior, while Reyes and 2 other privates dragged Alvarez alongside him. "Everyone who can hold a weapon, get to the wall. Everyone who can't stay down and stay quiet." Miller was already at the northern gap, rifle braced against a chunk of fallen stone, scanning the darkening ridge where 30 armed men moved with a discipline that chilled him more than any wild charge ever could. "Sir, they're not rushing us," he called back, voice tight. "They're taking positions, spreading out. This isn't an assault, this is a siege." Emily hadn't moved from the firing gap she'd claimed earlier, rifle steady, fixed to the scope, breathing slow and even, despite everything Brooks had just watched crack open inside her minutes before. "Carter," Brooks said, crouching beside her, "Yeah, talk to me, what's happening up there?" "They're setting overlapping fields of fire," Emily said, voice flat, professional, though Brooks could hear the effort it took to keep it that way. "2 elements flanking wide, 1 holding center. That's not insurgent tactics. That's textbook." "Your textbook," Emily's jaw tightened. "Someone's." A voice crackled faintly across the valley. Not a radio this time, but an actual human voice, amplified through some kind of loudspeaker rig, carrying across the wind with unnerving clarity. "Emily Carter." Every soldier in the shelter froze. The voice continued, accented but fluent, almost conversational in its calm. I know you can hear me. I have waited 3 years for this mountain." Emily's whole body went rigid. "Who is that?" Brooks whispered. Emily didn't answer. Her hands wrapped around the rifle stock had gone white-knuckled. "Carter," Brooks pressed. "Who is that Victor?" She breathed the name coming out like something poisonous. "Victor Kessel." The voice carried on, unhurried, almost amused. "You remember me? Good. I was worried 3 years in a new uniform might have erased me from that pretty head of yours." "Who is he?" Miller demanded, gripping his rifle tighter. Emily's eyes stayed locked on the ridge on some point in the smoke and shadow where the voice was coming from. "He was contracted security for the weapons network my unit was sent to dismantle 3 years ago. Former Special Forces gone private, gone very, very wrong. He wasn't supposed to be there. He wasn't supposed to survive that night." "But he did," Brooks said. "He did," Emily said. "Because of my age." The loudspeaker crackled again. "3 years ago, I watched you hesitate, little sniper. 3 seconds. That is all it took. Your friend, the woman with red bow hair, she paid for those 3 seconds, didn't she?" Something broke behind Emily's eyes just for an instant. Grief so raw it looked physically painful. "He was there," she whispered. "He was there when Hannah died. He's the reason the extraction fell apart in the first place. I have thought about you every single day." The voice continued to closer, though Brooks couldn't tell if that was distance or just the terrible intimacy of the words themselves. "I promised myself if I ever found you again, I would make you freeze one more time, and this time there would be no one left to save." "Carter," Brooks said urgently, "I need you here, right now, not 3 years ago, here." Emily's breathing had gone shallow, uneven, the first crack in the composure that had carried her through helicopters and mortars and moving vehicles. "Emily," Brooks said again, deliberately using her first name, forcing her focus back onto him. "Look at me." Slowly she did. "That man wants you paralyzed," Brooks said. "That's his whole plan. He's not just here to kill us. He's here to make you relive the worst moment of your life so you freeze again. Don't give him that." Emily's jaw worked, breath still ragged. "What if I can't stop it?" "You already have," Brooks said. "3 times today. You are not the same person who froze 3 years ago, Carter. I've watched you prove that over and over in the last 2 hours." Before Emily could respond, the ridge erupted. Muzzle flashes strobed across 30 positions, simultaneously rounds tearing into the shelter's stone walls in a hail that sent everyone diving for cover. Miller returned fire from the northern gap, joined a heartbeat later by 2 other riflemen, their shots cracking out in a desperate rhythm against an enemy that vastly outnumbered them. "They're pushing the flanks!" Reyes screamed, adjusting his position as rounds chewed the stone inches from his head. "Left side, they're trying to get an angle on the wounded." "Carter, I need that flank suppressed," Brooks shouted. Emily didn't hesitate. She swung the rifle toward the left flank, breath steadying with a visible act of will, and fired. One enemy soldier dropped. Then another as she cycled the bolt with mechanical precision, despite hands that Brooks could see were trembling faintly at the edges. "Confirmed, confirmed," she said, voice clipped, fighting to hold the professional distance that had carried her this far. "Flank slowing." "They're regrouping for another push," Miller shouted. 2 minutes into the firefight, and already Brooks could feel the platoon's ammunition draining at a rate that terrified him. He did the math in his head, magazines remaining, wounded soldiers who couldn't fight 30 hostiles against maybe a dozen able bodies, and the number came back grim, no matter how he calculated it. "Sir," Reyes shouted, "they've got a heavy weapon moving up on the right, looks like a PKM. If that gets set up, we're finished." Emily was already turning, tracking breath catching for just a fraction of a second longer than it should have. "Carter," Brooks pressed. "I see it," she said, voice tighter now. Her scope found the machine gun team setting up behind a rock outcrop 200 meters out, and for a moment, just a moment, her finger hovered on the trigger without firing. "Carter, take the shot." Emily's breath hitched. The gunner finished setting up the tripod. Brooks watched helpless as precious seconds ticked by with Emily frozen behind the scope, her earlier composure fracturing under the weight of Victor's voice still echoing in her memory. "Emily," Brooks barked sharper now, "take the shot." Something in his voice, not command, but something closer to a lifeline, seemed to snap her back. She exhaled hard and fired. The gunner dropped before he could charge the weapon. "Confirmed." Emily gasped, and this time her voice cracked audibly on the word. You good? Brooks asked, crouching beside her. No, Emily admitted, breathing hard. But I'm here. That would have to be enough. Bisao. 6 minutes into the siege, the enemy shifted tactics again, probing testing, pulling back from direct assault into something more patient, more calculated. The gunfire slowed to sporadic bursts, punctuated by long stretches of tense silence that felt somehow worse than the chaos. They're trying to bleed our ammo, Miller said, sliding down behind the wall to reload, hands shaking with adrenaline and exhaustion in equal measure. Make us waste rounds on nothing, wear us down before the real push. How much do we have left? Brooks asked. Miller checked face grim. Enough for maybe one more sustained engagement. After that, we're down to sidearms and whatever's left in Carter's rifle. Brooks looked toward Emily, who had pulled back from the firing position, just slightly chest-heaving, eyes distant in a way that worried him more than any wound. Carter, he said, crouching beside her again, talk to me. What's Victor's endgame here? He's had 30 men and every tactical advantage for the last 6 minutes, and he hasn't overrun this position. Why? Emily was quiet for a moment, gathering herself. And when she spoke, her voice had steadied into something colder, more analytical, the voice Brooks realized of the operative she used to be resurfacing beneath the grief. He doesn't want to win this the easy way, she said. He wants me to watch everyone here die first. That's the whole plan. He's not attacking to kill us quickly. He's attacking to make me feel exactly what I felt 3 years ago, helpless out of time, watching people I'm responsible for die one by one. Then we don't give him that, Brooks said firmly. We don't play his game. His men outnumber us 3-1, Emily said. I don't know how much choice we have. You said it yourself, Brooks said. He wants you paralyzed. He wants you to freeze. Every second you spend fighting your own head is a second he's winning without firing another shot. So don't fight your head, fight him. Something in Emily's expression shifted, not relief exactly, but resolve hardening back into place. Sir, Reyes called suddenly, voice tight with alarm. Movement, they're pushing again. Both flanks, this time I count. He swallowed hard. I count them converging here. They're not probing anymore. This is the real assault. The ridge lit up with gunfire again, more intense than before, rounds hammering the shelter's crumbling walls from 3 directions at once. A young private named Kowalski screamed as a round caught his arm, spinning him against the stone. Medic! Someone shouted uselessly because there was no medic left, only Emily, who was pinned behind her rifle trying to hold back 30 men with a 5-round magazine. Kowalski's hit! He's hit bad, Reyes shouted. Brooks made a split-second decision, crawling across open ground under fire to reach the wounded private, dragging him back behind cover as rounds cracked past close enough to feel the heat. Sir, you can't keep doing that, Miller shouted. You're the only one who can hold this line together. If you go down, then hold it together, Sergeant. Brooks snapped, applying pressure to Kowalski's wound with hands slick with blood. That's an order. Emily fired again and again, the rifle's report becoming a metronome against the chaos, each shot, finding a mark, each confirmed kill-buying seconds that felt impossibly precious. I'm dry, she shouted, suddenly ejecting an empty magazine, hands moving fast to reload from the last of her spare rounds. This is my last mag. How many rounds? Brooks called. Wow. Rounds against an enemy force that, even after everything Emily had done, still numbered more than 20. We need another option, Miller said, voice edging toward panic. Sir, we cannot hold this position with 5 rounds and small arms against that many hostiles. Brooks's mind raced, sifting through options that all seemed to end the same terrible way. Then his eyes fell on the terrain beyond the shelter, a narrow defile leading down toward a rocky wash that might offer a fighting withdrawal if they could break contact cleanly. Fighting retreat, he said. We move the wounded through the defile while Carter holds this position with what she's got left. We buy 60 seconds, maybe 90, and then we fall back to a tighter choke point where their numbers matter less. That leaves Carter alone up here, Miller said. I know, Brooks said grimly. Emily, overhearing, didn't hesitate. Do it. I can hold 60 seconds, maybe more. Carter. Sir, we don't have another plan, Emily said. Voice hard now, all traces of the earlier crack gone, replaced by something forged and certain. Get them moving. Brooks hated it. Every instinct told him it was wrong, But the alternative was watching his entire platoon get overrun in the next 5 minutes, and there simply wasn't time to argue. 60 seconds, he said. Then you're falling back too. That's an order, Carter, not a request. Understood, Emily said, though something in her eyes told Brooks she wasn't entirely sure she'd be able to keep that promise. The withdrawal began in chaos, wounded men dragged and half-carried through the narrow defile, while Miller and two others laid down covering fire toward the enemy's advancing line. Emily held her position at the Northern Gap rifle steady, despite everything picking off targets, with a precision that bought every second Brooks desperately needed. 30 seconds, Reyes shouted from further down the defile. Emily fired again. Another confirmed kill. 2 rounds left. 20 seconds. Movement flickered at the edge of her vision, not from the main assault line, but from a smaller group breaking off, moving fast along a flanking route that would put them behind her position within moments. "They're flanking," Emily said under her breath, adjusting, firing her second-to-last round toward the lead flanker. He dropped. 1 round left. "Carter, fall back now!" Brooks's voice carried from the defile, raw with urgency. Emily fired her last round at the closest remaining threat, then abandoned the positions, sprinting low and fast toward the defile as enemy fire chewed the ground behind her. A round clipped her shoulder, not deep, but enough to spin her half off balance enough to send fire lancing down her arm. "Carter's hit!" Miller screamed, breaking cover to lay down suppressive fire as Emily staggered the last 20 meters into the defile. She collapsed against the rock wall, breathing hard blood soaking through her sleeve, but alive. "I'm okay," she gasped before anyone could ask. "It's a graze. Keep moving." Brooks grabbed her good arm, hauling her upright, pulling her deeper into the narrow passage as the platoon scrambled toward the tighter choke point he'd identified. Behind them, the enemy's pursuit slowed not from lack of will, but from the geography itself, the narrow defile forcing them into single file, where their numbers advantage evaporated. For the first time in nearly 20 minutes, Bravo Company had bought themselves breathing room. They reached the choke point, a narrow gap between 2 collapsed rock faces that offered a single approach any attacker would have to funnel through 12 minutes after abandoning the shelter. Brooks immediately set what remained of his able-bodied soldiers into defensive positions, while Emily's teeth gritted against the pain in her shoulder, allowed Reyes to hastily wrap the wound. "This isn't sustainable, sir," Miller said quietly, voice low enough that only Brooks and Emily could hear. "We bought time, but Victor's not going to stop. We've got wounded who need real medical attention, ammunition that's basically gone, and a QRF that's still hours out." "I know," Brooks said grimly. Emily, wincing as Reyes tightened the dressing, spoke up. "There's something you both need to understand about Victor. He's not going to send his whole force through a choke point like this. That's tactically stupid, and whatever else he is, he's not stupid." "So what does he do instead?" Brooks asked. "He waits us out," Emily said. "He knows we're low on ammo. He knows we've got wounded. He has time and numbers on his side. All he has to do is hold position and let exhaustion and attrition do the work for him." "Then we need another option," Brooks said, echoing Miller's words from minutes earlier, except this time there was real desperation underneath them. Emily was quiet for a long moment, staring back down the defile toward the position they'd abandoned toward the ridge, where 30 men, minus however many she'd managed to eliminate, were regrouping under a commander who had spent 3 years waiting for exactly this moment. "There might be one," she said slowly. "I'm listening," Brooks said. "There's an old Soviet-era watchtower about 400 meters northeast of here," Emily said. "I spotted it on approach before the ambush started. If I can get eyes on Victor's actual position from there, a clean elevated line of sight, I might be able to end this the way it should have ended 3 years ago." "You're talking about going after him directly," Brooks said, understanding dawning along with a cold dread. "Alone." "I'm talking about removing the one man holding this entire assault together," Emily said. "Victor isn't just their commander, sir. He's their motivation. His men aren't fighting for a cause. They're fighting because he's paying them and because they're afraid of him. Take him out, and I promise you that formation up there stops being an army and starts being 30 scared men with no reason to keep dying on this mountain." "And if you're wrong," Brooks asked, "if you go up there alone and it doesn't work?" Emily met his eyes, and for the first time since the ambush began, Brooks saw something settle in her expression. Not fear, not doubt, but a kind of grim, hard-won clarity. "Then at least I'll have died doing what I was trained to do," she said quietly, "instead of hiding from it in a supply tent for 3 years." "That's not an answer I can accept," Brooks said. It's the only one I've got, Emily said. Sir, look around you. We have maybe 6 able-bodied soldiers, wounded men who need evacuation in the next hour, or they won't make it, in an enemy force that outnumbers us and knows exactly where we are. I can either sit here and watch this position get overrun in the next 30 minutes, or I can do something about the one man actually driving this assault. Brooks looked around the choke point at Miller, reloading his last magazine, with hands that wouldn't quite stop shaking at Kowalski's pale face, as Reyes tried to stabilize a wound that was clearly beyond field treatment at Alvarez drifting in and out of consciousness against the rock wall. She wasn't wrong, and that was the worst part. If you go, Brooks said finally, voice heavy, you go with a plan, not a death wish. You understand me? I understand, Emily said. And you come back, Brooks added more firmly than he intended. That's not a request either, Carter. Whatever guilt you've been carrying for 3 years, it does not get resolved by you dying on this mountain. It gets resolved by you living long enough to actually forgive yourself. Something flickered behind Emily's eyes, surprised maybe at hearing her own unspoken fears said out loud by someone who'd known her for less than a week. I'll try, she said quietly. It was the most honest answer she had. Miller approached, having overheard enough of the conversation to understand the shape of it. Sir, with respect, sending her out there alone is not up for debate, Sergeant, Brooks said. We don't have the numbers to send an escort, and every extra body is one more life at risk in an already impossible situation. Carter's the only one who can make this shot. She's the only one who's fought this man before. Miller looked at Emily for a long moment, and something in his expression finally completely shed the last of its earlier suspicion. Then make it count, he said, and for all of us. I intend to, Emily said. She checked what remained of her equipment, her rifle now down to whatever rounds Reyes could scavenge from fallen soldiers' kits, a sidearm, a knife, and nothing else. No radio that would reach far enough to matter. No backup. Nothing but 3 years of buried skill and a debt she'd spent every day since trying not to think about. Carter, Brooks said as she prepared to move out. One more thing. She paused. Hannah, Brooks said carefully, she wouldn't want you doing this to punish yourself. Whatever happened 3 years ago, I don't think the woman who trained you would want her legacy to be you, throwing your life away trying to settle a score. Emily's throat tightened, something raw and unhealed flickering across her face before she forced it back down. She wouldn't, Emily admitted quietly. But this isn't about settling a score anymore, sir. It's about making sure nobody else pays for my mistakes. Not you, not your soldiers, nobody. She turned and moved out into the deepening dusk, rifle slung across her back, moving with the same silent, purposeful efficiency she'd shown from the very first moment she'd opened that equipment bag on the ridge. Brooks watched her disappear into the rocks, and for a long moment the choke point was silent except for the wind and the distant, restless murmur of 30 enemy soldiers regrouping on the ridge above. Sir, Reyes said quietly, do you think she can actually do this? One shot, one man in the middle of 30 hostiles. Brooks didn't answer right away. He thought about the ridge, about the moving vehicle, about the helicopter's shattered cockpit glass, about a woman who 5 days ago he hadn't known existed and who had since become the only reason any of them were still breathing. I think, he said finally, that Emily Carter has spent 3 years convinced she wasn't capable of doing what needs to happen tonight. I think tonight she's about to prove herself wrong. Somewhere in the darkness ahead, moving low and silent toward an old Soviet watchtower, in a reckoning 3 years in the making. Emily Carter checked her remaining ammunition one final time and forced her breathing into the same slow, controlled rhythm that had carried her through every impossible shot that day. But this time was different. This time the target wasn't just another enemy combatant on a battlefield. This time it was the man who had watched Hannah die and who had spent 3 years waiting to make Emily watch someone die too. As she reached the base of the crumbling tower and began her climb, a radio clipped to a dead soldier's vest, one she'd taken without really thinking about, why crackled faintly to life in her pocket, carrying Victor's voice one more time, closer now, colder now. I know you're coming, little sniper, he said almost gently. I've been waiting 3 years for you to finally stop running. Emily's hand tightened on the tower's broken ladder rung, and for just a moment the ghost of Hannah's voice echoed in her memory, calm and steady the way it always had been in the field. Breathe, aim, trust yourself, she kept climbing. Below her, unseen in the deepening dark, 30 men were already beginning to move, not toward the choke point where Brooks and the wounded remained, but outward, spreading into a wider perimeter, because Victor Kessel had just realized exactly what his once-in-a-lifetime target was about to attempt. And he had absolutely no intention of making it easy. The ladder rungs were rusted through in places, and twice Emily felt one shift beneath her boot before she caught her weight on the next. She kept climbing anyway because stopping meant thinking and thinking meant remembering, and remembering was the one thing she couldn't afford right now. Below, spread through the rocks and scrub in the deepening dark, Victor's men were repositioning. She could hear them if she listened hard enough. The faint scrape of boots on stone, a muffled cough, quickly suppressed the particular quiet of disciplined soldiers trying not to be heard. They weren't chasing her toward the choke point anymore. They were spreading wide, encircling the tower. He knows exactly where I'm going, Emily thought. Of course he does. He's been planning this longer than I have. She reached the top of the ladder and pulled herself through a collapsed section of floor into what remained of the watchtower's observation platform, 3 walls, half a roof, and a view across the entire valley that made her chest tighten with recognition. It was almost too perfect. Almost like Victor had chosen this ground himself, decades of Soviet occupation, leaving behind exactly the kind of elevated position a sniper would be drawn to, exactly the kind of trap a patient man would prepare for. She dropped low rifle coming off her shoulder and pressed her back against the crumbling stone. Her radio stolen off a dead soldier's vest without much thought, beyond needing anything that might let her track. Enemy movement crackled softly in her jacket pocket. "You found it?" Victor's voice said, calm, almost warm. "I wondered if you would remember that towers like this exist. You always did have good instincts for high ground, little sniper. Hannah taught you well." Emily's jaw clenched. She didn't respond. Responding was what he wanted, proof she was listening, proof she was rattled. "Nothing to say," Victor continued. "That's all right. I remember you were always better with a rifle than with words." Emily eased forward, the scope rising to sweep the valley floor, searching through gathering darkness for any sign of her target. Muzzle flash, movement, anything, nothing. He's not exposing himself, she realized. He's smarter than that now. 3 years is a long time to plan a reunion, Victor's voice said through the radio, and Emily finally understood he wasn't broadcasting blind. He had eyes on the tower. He knew exactly where she was, and he was talking directly to her, close enough that the transmission had almost no delay. She went still, every instinct screaming at her to move, to relocate, to not become a fixed target for a man who had spent 3 years thinking about how to kill her. Too late. The first shot cracked into the stone 18 inches from her head, showering her with rock fragments. Emily dropped it flat, heart hammering, and rolled toward the tower's opposite wall as a second round chewed into the space she'd just vacated. "Close," Victor's voice said through the radio, almost admiring. "You're faster than you used to be. Fear does that, makes the body move before the mind catches up." "I'm not afraid of you," Emily said, finally breaking her silence, voice low and hard even as she scrambled to a new firing position along the tower's northern edge. "No," Victor said. "Then why does your voice shake?" It didn't. Emily had made sure of that, but the observation landed anyway, needling at something old and unhealed. She scanned the tree line where the shot had originated, calculating angle, distance, elevation, and found nothing. No muzzle flash lingering in her vision, no shifted shadow. He'd fired and relocated before she could even process the shot, exactly the kind of discipline she'd have expected from someone who'd trained under the same doctrine she had. "You're using my own methods against me," she said quietly, more to herself than to him. "I learned from the best," Victor said. 3 years ago, I watched your unit operate for 6 hours before you finally found us. I learned every habit, every pattern, every weakness, especially yours." Another shot cracked out, this one striking close enough to spray dust across her shoulder. Emily rolled again, breath ragged now, despite every effort to control it, and pressed herself into the deepest shadow the collapsed structure offered. Below at the choke point, 400 meters away, Brooks heard the exchange of gunfire echo across the valley and felt his stomach drop. "That's her," Miller said grimly, listening to the distant cracks. "She's engaged." "How many shooters?" Brooks asked, though he already dreaded the answer. Reyes, scanning through a pair of scavenged binoculars in the fading light, shook his head slowly. "I can't tell for sure, sir, but that doesn't sound like just Victor. That sounds like at least 2, maybe 3 shooters working the tower." Brooks felt something cold settle into his chest. "She's alone up there against multiple guns." Sir, we can't reach her in time even if we tried, Miller said. That's 400 meters of open hostile ground. We'd be walking into the same encirclement she is. Brooks knew he was right. He hated that he was right. Then all we can do is hold this position and pray, he said, voice tight, and hope to God that girl is as good as she's shown us today. On the tower, Emily's world had narrowed to breath and instinct. 3 shooters. She'd counted the distinct rifle reports, now cataloging subtle differences in pitch and cadence, the way Hannah had taught her years ago. Victor and 2 others likely his best position to flank the tower from separate angles while he anchored the center. This is exactly what happened 3 years ago, a small, terrified voice whispered in the back of her mind. Surrounded, outnumbered, no backup. Emily forced the thought down hard the same way she'd forced down every wave of panic since the ambush began. She would not let that memory dictate this moment. She would not become the girl who froze. A round snapped past her ear close enough that she felt the displaced air against her skin, and she returned fire on instinct toward the muzzle flash she'd caught in her peripheral vision. A snapshot not aimed with her usual careful precision, but fast reactive. A grunt of pain echoed across the valley. You hit someone, Victor's voice observed through the radio, sounding almost pleased. Good. I was worried 3 years of hiding had made you soft. You talk a lot for someone who's losing men, Emily said, voice steadier now. Some old familiar coldness settling into her chest as the fight sharpened her focus instead of scattering it. Am I? Victor said. Or am I simply patient? You have what, perhaps 10 rounds left in that rifle. I have 30 men on this mountain, little sniper. Patience is the one advantage numbers always provide. Emily's stomach tightened because he wasn't wrong. She'd counted her remaining rounds twice already, and the number hadn't improved between checks. 7 rounds, against a commander and 2 skilled shooters, with 27 more men somewhere in the darkness below, ready to close in the moment she made a fatal mistake. She needed a different approach. Attrition wasn't going to work in her favor, not against these numbers. Emily's mind raced back through everything Hannah had ever taught her. Not just marksmanship, but the deeper lessons, the ones about surviving impossible odds. Hannah's voice echoed in memory, calm and certain, the way it always had been in the worst moments. You don't win a fight like this with more bullets, Em. You win it by making them doubt everything they think they know. Emily's eyes swept the tower's structure, the crumbling walls, the exposed beams, the precarious platform she was crouched on. An idea began forming, dangerous and desperate, but it was the only option that didn't end with her simply running out of ammunition and options at the same time. She keyed the stolen radio. Victor, she said, voice deliberately calm, deliberately controlled. Yes, little sniper. You said you learned everything from watching my unit operate 3 years ago, Emily said. Then you should remember what happened to the last man who thought he had me cornered. A pause. When Victor spoke again, some of the easy confidence had thinned just slightly. You're trying to unsettle me. It won't work. I'm not trying, Emily said. I'm reminding you. You lost half your unit that night trying to pin me down. And that was before I had 3 more years of practice. It was a bluff mostly. 3 years of hiding hadn't exactly been practice, not in the way Victor would assume. But bluffing had always been part of the job, too. And right now, doubt was the only weapon she had that wasn't running low on ammunition. Silence stretched across the radio for several long seconds. Then from the darkness below, Emily heard something she hadn't expected. Hesitation. A pause in the coordinated movement she'd been tracking through sound-alone footsteps, stalling voices, murmuring in a language she recognized but couldn't fully translate, urgent and uncertain. He's talking to his men, she realized. I got to him. Clever, Victor said, finally a voice tighter now. But words don't stop bullets, Emily Carter. And you are still alone on that tower with the sun almost gone, and 30 men who do not care about your reputation, only about the money I am paying them to end it. As if to prove his point, gunfire erupted again, this time from multiple positions, simultaneously rounds hammering into the tower's crumbling stone from at least 4 different angles. Emily dropped flat debris raining down around her, and for one terrifying moment felt the old paralysis creeping at the edges of her mind, the same freeze, the same helpless stillness that had cost Hannah her life 3 years ago. No, she told herself, fighting against it with everything she had. Not again. Not this time. She forced herself to move, rolling toward a support beam that offered marginally better cover. Rifle already rising, eye already finding the scope. 3 muzzle flashes registered in quick succession from her left. She fired at the closest, then shifted firing again at the second before the first shooter could reposition. 2 confirmed hits, 5 rounds left. They're pulling back your suppression, Emily muttered to herself, recognizing the pattern shifting even as it happened. Victor's remaining men were regrouping, consolidating, clearly recalibrating their approach after losing 2 more shooters to a target they'd expected to overwhelm through sheer volume. Her radio crackled again, Victor's voice noticeably strained now. "You are becoming an expensive problem, Emily Carter." "I told you," Emily said, breath coming yes hard but controlled. "I've had 3 years to think about this conversation." "Then let us finish it," Victor said, and something in his tone shifted colder, more final. "Since you enjoy reminders so much, let me remind you of something too." A new voice crackled onto the frequency, panicked female speaking broken English with obvious terror. "Please, please, someone help. They have me, please." Emily's blood went ice cold. "Who is that?" she demanded, voice cracking for the first time since she'd climbed the tower. "A local villager," Victor said almost casually. "Unfortunate timing. My men found her hiding near the eastern approach. I thought perhaps she could help remind you what happens when you hesitate, little sniper. When you make the wrong choice because your heart got in the way of your training." Emily's hands, steady through every impossible shot of the day, began to shake. "You're bluffing," she said, though even as the words left her mouth, she wasn't certain. "Am I?" Victor said. "Come find out. Eastern Ridge, 200 meters from your position. Bring your rifle. Bring whatever courage you have left. Or stay hidden in your tower and let another innocent person pay for your hesitation. The choice is always, little sniper, is yours." The radio went silent. Emily's mind raced, Hannah's memory colliding violently with the present moment. The exact same impossible calculus she'd faced 3 years ago, suddenly resurrected with terrifying precision. Trust her instincts and move, potentially walking into an ambush designed specifically to finish what tonight had started. Or stay, hold her position, and risk an innocent life to protect her own tactical advantage. 3 seconds of hesitation had cost Hannah's life. Emily was not going to let history repeat itself. She moved. Descending the tower faster than she'd climbed it, Emily's mind raced through every possible scenario, every way this could be exactly the trap it sounded like, and every reason she had to take the risk anyway. At the base of the ladder, she paused, breathing hard, forcing herself to think instead of simply react. If this is a trap, she told herself, then charging in blind gets me killed and doesn't save anyone. Think like Hannah taught you. Think like a sniper, not like a scared kid. She keyed the radio voice steadier than she felt. "Victor, if she's really there, prove it. Let me hear her again." A pause, then the same frightened voice returned. "Please, I have children. Please, I don't understand what's happening." The details were too specific, too textured with real fear for Emily to dismiss it as pure theater. But something about it still nagged at her, some instinct honed by years of training that Hannah had drilled into her relentlessly. Distance, angle, voice clarity through a stolen radio that shouldn't have that kind of range unless the villager was being held remarkably close to Victor's own position, which meant close to Victor himself. A slow, cold realization settled over Emily. He's not just using her as leverage, she thought. He's using her as bait to draw me into his kill zone. But that means he has to keep her close to wherever he actually is. It was a terrible, desperate gamble, but it was the only lead she had. Emily moved through the darkness with practiced silence, following the terrain toward the eastern ridge Victor had specified, every sense alert for the ambush she was certain was waiting. She spotted the first sentry from 30 meters out, a lone gunman positioned at the edge of a rocky outcrop, clearly watching for her approach. She could have shot him from where she stood. Instead, she circled wide, using the darkness in the terrain to bypass him entirely, saving her remaining rounds for a target that actually mattered. Closer to the ridge, she heard voices. Victor's low and commanding, and the frightened villagers still pleading, close enough now that Emily could tell the fear in it, while genuine was being directed by someone standing very near. She found a vantage point behind a cluster of boulders, 40 meters from the small clearing where Victor stood, with 2 remaining guards flanking a terrified older woman held at gunpoint between them. Emily's heart clenched at the sight of the woman, genuinely, unmistakably a civilian, not an actress, not a plant, exactly as frightened as she'd sounded over the radio. Whatever else Victor was, he hadn't been bluffing about that part, which meant this was real, and that made everything infinitely more dangerous. Emily raised her rifle scope, finding Victor's position with brutal clarity for the first time since the fight had begun. He stood with casual confidence, sidearm loose in his hand, clearly certain of his advantage, even now. 4 rounds left. One shot at Victor. One shot might be enough to end this entirely exactly the way it should have ended 3 years ago. But Victor stood directly beside the terrified woman, his guards positioned close enough that any shot risked hitting her instead or triggering an immediate execution the moment gunfire erupted. Emily's finger hovered on the trigger breath, catching in her throat as the same paralyzing weight from 3 years ago threatened to drag her under one more time. Move, don't move, shoot. Wait. Hannah's voice, calm and steady, cut through the noise in her mind. You don't have to make the perfect shot, Em. You have to make the right one. Emily exhaled, slowly recalculating. Not Victor first. The guard closest to the woman, the one whose weapon was most directly threatening her life. Remove the immediate danger, then deal with Victor in the chaos that followed. She fired. The guard nearest the woman dropped instantly, and in the same heartbeat, Emily was already shifting, cycling the bolt, tracking the second guard as he spun toward the muzzle flash with his weapon rising. She fired again. He fell before he could complete the motion. The villager screamed and dropped to the ground, and Victor, for the first time since Emily had heard his voice again, looked genuinely, visibly startled, sidearm, already coming up as he searched frantically for her position. 2 rounds left. Impressive, Victor said, voice tight now, all pretense of calm control finally cracking. But you've made a mistake, little sniper. You had your shot at me, and you spent it on saving a stranger instead. That wasn't a mistake, Emily said, voice ringing out from her position, cold and absolutely certain, in a way that surprised even her. That's the difference between you and me, Victor. You've spent 3 years thinking my hesitation was weakness. It was never weakness. I just never wanted to become someone who could watch an innocent person die and call it strategy. Victor's eyes darted through the darkness, searching for her position. Weapon raised defensively now instead of confidently. Then finish it, he snarled. Prove you've actually changed since that night. Emily's scope found him fully, the crosshairs settling on his center mass with a steadiness that felt finally completely her own. Not fighting old grief, not fighting old guilt, just present, entirely present in this single decisive moment. Hannah didn't die because I hesitated to kill someone, Emily said quietly, mostly to herself. Now the words less for Victor and more for the ghost she'd been carrying for 3 years. She died because the choice I faced that night should never have existed in the first place. But this choice isn't that choice. This one's simple. She fired. The shot took Victor squarely in the chest, and he collapsed backward into the dirt. Without another word, without another threat, without the 3 years of anticipation he'd built around this exact moment, ending anything close to how he'd imagined. Silence rolled across the ridge. The villager, sobbing, scrambled toward the tree line, and Emily moved fast to intercept her, lowering her rifle, hands raised, voice gentle, despite everything her body was still processing. You're safe, Emily said, breathless. You're safe now, I promise. The woman collapsed into her shaking, and Emily held her for a brief, unguarded moment before the sound of scattered gunfire in the distance reminded her that the fight wasn't fully over. Not for her, not for Brooks, not for the platoon still holding a crumbling choke point 400 meters away. Emily's radio, still clipped to her jacket, crackled with a new voice, panicked. One of Victor's remaining soldiers speaking rapid, frightened words in a language Emily understood just enough to catch the gist of. Their commander is dead. Fall back now. Across the valley, the coordinated assault that had been slowly grinding down Bravo Company's position began to fracture exactly as Emily had predicted it would if Victor fell. Gunfire sputtered, hesitated, then began retreating entirely. Enemy soldiers abandoning positions without their commander's iron discipline holding them in place. At the choke point, Brooks heard the shift immediately. The change in tempo, the retreating fire, the sudden absence of the coordinated pressure that had been squeezing his position for the better part of an hour. Sir, Miller said, disbelief lighting his exhausted voice. I think they're pulling back. All of them. Brooks grabbed his binoculars, scanning the ridge where enemy positions were visibly chaotically abandoning their posts. She did it, he breathed. She actually did it. But even as relief flooded through the choke point, even as wounded soldiers who'd been bracing for the worst allowed themselves the first real hope they'd felt in hours, Brooks's eyes remained fixed on the darkening ridge toward the old Soviet tower, waiting for the one figure who mattered most to reappear from the smoke and shadow. Minutes passed, then more minutes. The silence stretched taut and unbearable until finally a lone shape emerged from the tree line, moving slowly, one arm cradled against her side rifle, slung across her back. "Carter!" Miller shouted, relief cracking his voice wide open. Emily staggered the last 100 meters into the choke point, exhaustion and blood loss, finally catching up with everything her body had endured over the last several hours. Brooks caught her before she could fully collapse, lowering her carefully against the rock wall. "It's done," Emily whispered, voice barely audible. "Victor's dead. They're falling back." "You did it," Brooks said, something rough and emotional, breaking through his usual command steadiness. "Carter, you actually did it." Emily's eyes fluttered, adrenaline finally completely draining out of her system, leaving behind nothing but bone-deep exhaustion and the throbbing pain of a shoulder wound she'd been ignoring for far too long. "Hannah," she whispered so quietly, Brooks almost missed it. "I did it, Hannah. I didn't freeze." Brooks knelt beside her, watching as her eyes finally closed, whether from exhaustion or something closer to unconsciousness, he couldn't immediately tell. "Reyes," he shouted, "I need whatever medical supplies we have left right now." As the platoon scrambled to stabilize their wounded and reorganize amid the retreating chaos of Victor's shattered command, Brooks remained beside Emily, one hand pressed against her uninjured shoulder, grounding himself in the aftermath of a battle that had asked more of one soldier than Brooks had ever seen asked of anyone. Somewhere in the far distance, the faint, unmistakable thrum of approaching helicopters finally broke through the mountain silence, not an enemy this time, but the QRF hours as head of Overwatch's grim estimate, drawn in by wreckage and gunfire that had been impossible to ignore. Brooks allowed himself, for the first time since the ambush began, a single exhausted breath of genuine relief. But even as rescue finally arrived, even as wounded soldiers were carried toward waiting stretchers, and the nightmare of that mountain ridge began slowly to recede into memory, Brooks couldn't shake one final nagging thought. Emily Carter had just ended a war that had been 3 years in the making. But the woman lying unconscious against that rock wall, the one who had saved every single life in Bravo Company that day, still carried a weight Brooks wasn't entirely certain any battlefield victory could fully lift. Whatever came next, whatever recovery and reckoning still waited beyond this mountain, Brooks understood one thing with absolute certainty as the helicopters finally touched down and medics rushed forward to take over. The girl nobody had noticed 5 days ago had just become the reason an entire platoon would go home tonight. And somewhere deep beneath the exhaustion and the pain and 3 years of unspoken grief, Emily Carter had finally truly stopped running. The sound Emily woke up to wasn't gunfire. It wasn't Victor's voice through a stolen radio. It was the steady, unfamiliar beep of a heart monitor. And for several long, disoriented seconds, she couldn't understand why that terrified her more than the mountain had. Her eyes opened slowly, adjusting to fluorescent light instead of smoke and dusk. White walls, a window with real glass, the dull ache of her shoulder wrapped tight in clean bandages instead of a field dressing. A hospital. She was safe. Her body didn't seem to believe it yet. Her hand twitched toward a rifle that wasn't there, muscle memory firing before conscious thought caught up, and the absence of the weapon sent a fresh wave of disorientation crashing through her. "Easy," a voice said. "You're okay." Emily turned her head, wincing at the pull in her shoulder, and found Captain Brooks sitting in a chair pulled close to the bed, still in uniform, still looking like a man who hadn't slept properly in days. "Sir," she rasped, throat-dry, voice barely working. "Don't," Brooks said almost gently. "Don't sir me right now. Just breathe." Emily obeyed, chest rising and falling slowly, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, the breath didn't come with the weight of a scope pressed to her cheek or a decision that might cost someone their life. How long she managed? 3 days, Brooks said. "You lost more blood than anyone realized out there. Between the shoulder and the exhaustion, your body just shut down once the adrenaline finally ran out." Emily closed her eyes, images from the mountain flickering behind her lids. The tower, Victor's voice, the terrified villager the moment she'd pulled the trigger, and finally, after 3 years, hadn't hesitated. "The platoon," she said suddenly, eyes snapping open. "Alvarez, Kowalski, Dawson. All alive, Brooks said quickly, cutting off the rising panic in her voice. Every single one of them, Carter. Alvarez lost a lot of blood, but he's stable. Kowalski's arm is going to need surgery, but he'll keep it. Dawson's already complaining about hospital food, which I take as a very good sign. Something in Emily's chest loosened a knot she hadn't fully realized she was still carrying. They're alive, she repeated quietly, like she needed to hear herself say it to fully believe it. Because of you, Brooks said. Every one of them. You understand that, right? Not because of luck. Not because the enemy made a mistake. Because Emily Carter decided over and over again on that mountain that she wasn't going to let anyone else die on her watch. Emily's throat tightened, and she looked away toward the window, toward a sky that looked almost unbearably ordinary after everything. I froze, she said quietly, up on the tower before I went after the villager. I froze for a second, just like, you didn't freeze, Brooks said firmly. Carter, I've commanded soldiers for 15 years. I know exactly what freezing looks like. What I watched you do out there wasn't freezing. It was thinking. There's a difference, and it's the difference that saved that woman's life instead of costing it. Doesn't feel that different, Emily admitted. It never does right after, Brooks said. That's the part nobody tells you about this job. The moment doesn't feel like victory when you're standing inside it. It just feels like surviving. The victory part comes later when you finally understand what you actually did. Emily was quiet for a long moment, processing that, letting it settle somewhere alongside 3 years of guilt that had never quite loosened its grip until now. Victor, she said finally, is it confirmed he's really dead? Brooks said. Confirmed. Command's already been through the intelligence. Turns out your Victor Kessel wasn't just some rogue contractor holding a grudge. He'd built himself into a fairly significant node in a regional weapons network over the last 3 years. Command thinks the ambush that hit us wasn't random at all. They think Victor had been watching troop movements in this region for months, waiting for an opportunity. Waiting for me, Emily said quietly. Maybe, Brooks admitted, or maybe he was just waiting for any convoy that gave him a shot at revenge, and it happened to be ours. Either way, Carter, that network took a devastating hit when he went down. Command's calling it one of the most significant tactical outcomes in this sector in over a year. Emily let out a breath that felt like it had been trapped in her chest for 3 years. Hannah would have, she started, then stopped, throat closing around the words. Brooks didn't push. He simply waited, giving her the space to finish or not finish, whichever she needed. Hannah would have said, I did good, Emily finished quietly, voice cracking on the last word. She'd be right, Brooks said. The recovery took longer than Emily expected, and far longer than she wanted. Weeks turned into months, her shoulder healing slower than the surface wound suggested it should, doctors murmuring about nerve damage and physical therapy, and timelines that stretched frustratingly into an uncertain future. But the physical wound, Emily came to realize, was never really the hardest part to heal. 3 weeks into her recovery, a woman in civilian clothes visited her hospital room, introducing herself simply as Dr. Elena Voss, a military psychologist assigned to soldiers returning from what the paperwork blandly termed high-intensity engagement scenarios. Emily had been guarded at first, the old instinct to hide, to minimize, to disappear back into quiet anonymity, rising up exactly the way it had for 3 years before Brooks shouted a question on a mountain ridge and changed everything. I read the after-action report, Dr. Voss said during their second session, sitting across from Emily in a small, sterile office that smelled faintly of coffee and antiseptic. Multiple confirmed engagements, several under what the report calls extreme tactical duress. That's military language for something most people would call impossible. I did what needed doing, Emily said, the same deflection she'd used a dozen times already with a dozen different people. I believe that, Dr. Voss said. I also read the part of the report where you left an elite program 3 years ago after a mission that clearly still haunts you. And I noticed something interesting, Emily. In the entire 5 days before this ambush happened, according to your unit's records, you didn't request a single day of leave, didn't file a single complaint, didn't so much as raise your voice above a whisper in group settings. You built yourself into someone invisible. Emily's jaw tightened. Is there a question in there somewhere? Why, Dr. Voss asked simply, why work so hard to disappear if what happened on that mountain proves you're exactly the kind of soldier who saves lives when it matters most? Emily was quiet for a long moment, staring down at her hands, at fingers that had steadied a rifle through impossible shots, but still trembled slightly whenever this particular conversation arose. "Because the last time I was that soldier," she said finally, voice barely above a whisper, "someone I loved died because of 3 seconds I couldn't get back. And I decided it was safer for everyone if I just stopped being capable of that kind of responsibility." "Did it work?" Dr. Voss asked gently. "Did disappearing actually make you feel safer?" Emily thought about 5 days of eating alone in the mess hall, of avoiding eye contact, of carrying a rifle case everywhere she went, like a secret too heavy to set down even for a moment. "No," she admitted. "It just made me lonely instead of scared. I still carried all of it. I just carried it by myself." Dr. Voss nodded slowly, something patient and understanding in her expression. "That's often how it works, unfortunately. Guilt doesn't disappear just because we stop using the skills connected to it. It just finds quieter, more isolating ways to punish us." "So what do I do instead?" Emily asked, and there was something genuinely lost in the question, something that hadn't fully surfaced in 3 years of careful avoidance. "That," Dr. Voss said, "is exactly what we're going to spend the next several months figuring out together." The sessions continued through Emily's physical recovery, weeks bleeding into months, each conversation peeling back another layer of the guilt she'd buried 3 years earlier. Slowly, painfully, Emily began talking about Hannah, not just the mission, not just the 3 seconds that had haunted her, but the woman herself, the mentor who'd taught her patience instead of just precision, the friend who'd made impossible deployments feel survivable through dry humor and unshakable calm, the person who had believed in Emily long before Emily had learned to believe in herself. She used to say something, Emily told Dr. Voss during one particularly difficult session, voice thick with an emotion she'd spent 3 years refusing to fully feel. Right before every mission, she'd look at me and say, "Breathe, aim, trust yourself," every single time, like a ritual. "Did you trust yourself that night?" Dr. Voss asked carefully. Emily's eyes filled with tears she'd held back for 3 years, finally painfully allowing themselves to fall. "No," she whispered. "That's the truth I've never said out loud. I didn't freeze because the shot was hard. I froze because for 3 seconds I doubted myself so completely that I couldn't pull the trigger. And that hesitation, that doubt is what got her killed. Not bad luck, not an impossible situation. Me. And on the mountain," Dr. Voss said gently with Bravo Company, "did you doubt yourself then?" Emily thought about it honestly, really thought about it for the first time since she'd woken up in that hospital bed. There were moments, she admitted, the helicopter, the machine gun team setting up. Even Victor near the end when he had that villager. I felt the same fear rising every single time. "But you didn't freeze." "No," Emily said slowly, the realization settling over her with a weight that felt for once like relief instead of burden. "I felt the fear and I moved anyway. That's different, isn't it? That's not the same as not being afraid at all." That, Dr. Voss said something like quiet pride in her voice, is the entire difference between the girl who froze 3 years ago and the woman who saved an entire platoon on that mountain. Fear was never actually your enemy, Emily. Doubt was, and on that mountain for the first time in 3 years, you learned how to feel afraid and trust yourself anyway. Emily sat with that for a long moment, letting it settle into places that had been carrying guilt for far too long. "I think," she said finally quietly, "I think Hannah would want me to stop punishing myself for something that happened once 3 years ago, when I've spent every single day since then proving I learned from it." "I think she would too," Dr. Voss said. 6 months after the mountain, Emily's physical recovery had progressed enough for her shoulder to hold steady weight again, though doctors warned her the nerve damage would likely leave a permanent faint tremor in cold weather for the rest of her life. A small physical reminder she'd carry forward, not as punishment, but simply as part of her story now. Captain Brooks visited her one final time before her official reassignment orders came through, finding her in a quiet corner of the base gym, working through physical therapy exercises with the same disciplined focus she brought to everything. "Command wants to see you," he said without preamble, though there was something in his expression that told Emily this wasn't the kind of meeting that ended badly. "About what?" she asked, setting down the resistance band she'd been working with. "Your future," Brooks said simply. "I've read the recommendation. I helped write part of it, actually." Emily raised an eyebrow. "Should I be worried?" Brooks almost smiled, a rare enough expression from a man Emily had watched carry the weight of an entire platoon's survival on his shoulders for one of the longest days of both their lives at the masseuse. No, he said. I think for once you should let yourself be proud instead. The meeting took place in an office far quieter than Emily had expected. A senior officer she didn't recognize sitting across a desk covered in files, several of which Emily realized with quiet unease bore her own name. Private Carter, the officer said, though something in his tone made the rank sound almost like a formality he was already anticipating changing. Your file is unusual, to put it mildly. I'm aware, sir, Emily said carefully. Sentinel-weighted division flagged your resignation 3 years ago as a significant loss of capability. The officer continued flipping through a file. Their assessment at the time noted you as one of the most naturally gifted marksmen they'd trained in over a decade. Your voluntary withdrawal was, according to this report, considered one of the program's greatest disappointments. Emily's jaw tightened slightly, old defensiveness rising automatically. With respect, sir, I had my reasons. I know, the officer said more gently than Emily expected. I've read those too. Sergeant Reed's death, your subsequent request for reassignment. None of that is in question here, Carter. What's in question is what happens next. Emily felt something tighten in her chest. Sir. The officer set down the file, folding his hands, studying her with an expression that seemed to weigh her carefully before continuing. What you did on that mountain wasn't just impressive marksmanship, he said. It was leadership under conditions most trained officers never face in an entire career. You held a collapsing position together. You made tactical decisions under extreme duress that saved an entire platoon. And you did it all while managing personal trauma that would have paralyzed most people entirely. I just did what needed doing, sir, Emily said quietly, echoing the same deflection she'd offered Dr. Voss weeks earlier, though this time it felt slightly less like hiding and slightly more like simple honesty. That's precisely the point, the officer said. Command doesn't want to lose that instinct again. We're not interested in sending you back into a program that nearly broke you, Carter. But we are very interested in what you could offer somewhere else entirely. He slid a folder across the desk toward her. Emily opened it, slowly scanning the contents, and felt her breath catch. An instructor position, a newly established training program for developing precision marksmanship specialists, not just technical skill, but the psychological resilience Emily herself had spent 3 years struggling to rebuild. The program's stated mission, printed plainly across the cover page, made something in Emily's chest tighten with an emotion she hadn't expected. Training the next generation of operators not just to shoot, but to carry the weight of that responsibility without breaking under it. You'd be building this from nothing, the officer said. No existing curriculum, no established doctrine. Command wants someone who understands both sides of this job intimately, not just the skill required to make an impossible shot, but the human cost of carrying that skill for a lifetime. Emily looked up from the folder, throat tight. Why me, sir? There are others with better records, cleaner service histories. Because the officer said simply, we don't want someone with a clean history. We want someone who understands exactly what it costs when this job goes wrong and who's proven beyond any doubt that they can carry that cost and still choose to save lives anyway. That's not a lesson you can teach from a textbook, Carter. That's a lesson only lived experience can offer. Emily closed the folder, slowly feeling the weight of the decision settle over her. Not the crushing weight of 3 years of guilt, but something different. Something that felt for the first time in longer than she could remember, like purpose instead of punishment. I'll need to think about it, she said quietly, though something in her voice already suggested the answer she'd eventually give. Take your time, the officer said. But Carter, for what it's worth, I don't think there's anyone better suited for this than you. The decision took Emily 3 days. 3 days of quiet reflection, of long walks around the base, of one final conversation with Dr. Voss that helped her fully understand what she was choosing between. You're not going back to hide, Dr. Voss observed during their final scheduled session. That's different from what you tried to do 3 years ago. How so? Emily asked. 3 years ago, you ran from responsibility because you believed you couldn't survive carrying it, Dr. Voss said. This time you're choosing responsibility because you've proven to yourself and everyone around you that you can. That's not the same decision at all, Emily. That's growth. Emily thought about Hannah, about the mentor who'd shaped every part of the skill Emily now carried, about the years of patient teaching that had built her into someone capable of surviving that mountain ridge. I think, Emily said slowly, Hannah spent years teaching me things I only understood in the middle of that firefight. I think maybe it's my turn to pass that forward instead of burying it. I think that's exactly right, Dr. Voss said. Emily accepted the instructor position 2 days later. 6 months after that, Emily stood in front of a group of 18 young trainees, all of them fresh from selection, all of them carrying the same nervous, eager energy she remembered feeling herself a lifetime ago, before Sentinel Division and Hannah Reed, in a mountain ridge in eastern Afghanistan, had reshaped everything she understood about who she was capable of becoming. She held the same rifle that had carried her through that impossible day, the same M2010 that had dropped an enemy sniper at 900 meters, silenced a machine gun position, ended a moving vehicle's advance with a single impossible shot, and finally, after 3 years of running, closed the loop on a debt she'd carried since Hannah's death. The trainees watched her with a mixture of curiosity and quiet awe, several of them clearly having heard fragments of the story that had, despite Emily's efforts to remain private about it, spread through certain circles of the military community. The girl nobody noticed who'd drawn a sniper rifle out of a logistics bag and turned an impossible ambush into a fighting retreat that saved an entire platoon. Some of you have probably heard rumors, Emily said, addressing the group directly, her voice steady in a way that would have seemed impossible 3 years earlier, about a mountain ridge, about an ambush, about a supply clerk who turned out to be something else entirely. A few trainees exchanged glances, clearly uncertain whether acknowledging the rumors was appropriate. I'm not going to spend today confirming or denying any of it, Emily continued, because that's not actually the important part of the story. The important part is what I learned and what I nearly let destroy me before I learned it properly. She set the rifle down carefully on the table in front of her, and the room went completely silent. Every trainee's attention locked entirely on her next words. Precision, Emily said, is not about pulling a trigger. Any of you can learn to shoot straight. Given enough time, enough repetition, enough discipline, marksmanship is simply a mechanical skill, and mechanical skills can be taught to almost anyone with sufficient patience. She paused, letting the words settle, watching several trainees lean forward slightly, sensing that whatever came next mattered far more than the technical instruction they'd expected. What can't be mechanically taught, Emily continued, is understanding the responsibility behind that decision. Every single shot you take in this job changes the world in some way, whether you ever learn the full consequences or not. Sometimes that shot saves someone you will never meet, someone whose name you'll never know, whose gratitude you'll never receive. And sometimes that shot creates a burden you will carry for the rest of your life, whether you made the right call or not. Her voice caught slightly, just for a moment, and several trainees noticed, though none of them interrupted. I made a mistake once, Emily said quietly, honestly, in a way she never would have imagined herself capable of 3 years earlier. I hesitated when I shouldn't have, and someone I loved paid the price for that hesitation. For 3 years afterward, I believed the answer was to stop being capable of that kind of responsibility altogether. I buried my skills. I hid from every situation that might ask me to carry that weight again. She looked around the room, slowly meeting the eyes of every trainee in turn. I was wrong, she said simply. Running from responsibility doesn't erase the weight of it. It just means you carry that weight alone in silence without ever learning how to bear it properly. It took an ambush, a mountain, and an entire platoon's lives depending on me to finally understand that the answer was never to stop being capable. The answer was learning how to carry that capability without letting it destroy me. One trainee, a young woman near the front who reminded Emily faintly of herself at that same age, raised her hand hesitantly. How do you know, the trainee asked, when you have actually learned that? How do you know the difference between being ready and just telling yourself you're ready? Emily considered the question carefully, genuinely, before answering. You don't know for certain, she admitted. Not until you're tested. I didn't know, not really, until I was standing in the middle of an ambush with an entire platoon's survival depending on decisions I had to make in seconds. What I can tell you is this: the fear never fully goes away. I was afraid on that mountain, more afraid than I'd ever admit to most people. But fear and freezing are not the same thing. Freezing is what happens when doubt convinces you that you can't trust yourself. Fear is just your body reminding you how much the outcome matters. She picked the rifle back up, holding it not with the tension of someone haunted by what it represented, but with the calm, grounded confidence of someone who had finally made peace with exactly what it had cost her and exactly what it had allowed her to give back. "Somewhere out there," Emily said, voice steady now, carrying clearly across the silent room, "there are people alive today because a soldier made the right call under impossible pressure. Some of those people will never know it happened. Some of you in this room will carry decisions for the rest of your careers that most people will never fully understand. That is the weight of this job. That is what precision actually means." She paused, letting the silence stretch, letting the weight of her words settle fully before delivering the lesson that mattered more than any technical instruction she would ever teach them. "But I want you to understand something else too," Emily continued, the voice softening slightly, though losing none of its conviction. "The moment you stop caring about that weight, the moment pulling a trigger becomes easy, becomes mechanical, becomes something you do without feeling the full gravity of what it costs, that is the moment you should put the rifle down. Not because you've become incapable, because you've become dangerous in a different way. This job demands precision, but it demands conscience even more. Lose the conscience, and the precision becomes something worth fearing instead of trusting." The room remained silent for a long moment after she finished, 18 young trainees absorbing a lesson that Emily herself had needed 3 years of Mountain Ridge, an old mentor's memory, in one impossible day of survival to finally understand. Finally, the same young woman who'd asked the earlier question spoke again, voice quieter, this time almost reverent. "Thank you," she said simply, "for telling us the truth instead of just the technical stuff." Emily felt something settle in her chest, something that had been unsettled for 3 long years, finally finding a kind of peace she genuinely believed might be permanently out of reach. "That's the job," Emily said softly, "passing forward exactly what someone once gave me. My mentor taught me everything I know about this weapon. But more than that, she taught me why any of it mattered in the first place. I intend to spend the rest of my career making sure that lesson never gets lost the way I almost let it." Later that evening, after the trainees had filed out and the training facility had gone quiet, Emily remained behind alone, running her hands slowly along the familiar weight of the rifle that had carried her through the worst and most defining day of her life. She thought about Hannah, about red hair and dry humor and patient teaching that had shaped every part of who Emily had become. She thought about Captain Brooks, about a desperate shout across a chaotic battlefield that had somehow impossibly changed the entire trajectory of her life. She thought about Bravo Company, about Alvarez and Kowalski and Dawson and Miller and Reyes, all of them alive, all of them home, and all of them carrying forward lives that continued only because Emily had finally, after 3 years, chosen to stop running from who she really was. She thought about the mountain, about smoke and gunfire, and impossible shots, about a helicopter's shattering canopy and a moving vehicle's commander falling before he could give another devastating order. She thought about Victor, about 3 years of patient, poisonous waiting, finally ending in a single confirmed shot that had closed a wound Emily had carried since the night Hannah died. And she thought finally about the quiet, invisible woman who had spent 5 days organizing supply crates, avoiding eye contact, eating alone, convinced that hiding was the only way to survive the guilt of a single catastrophic mistake. That woman was gone now, not erased, not forgotten, but transformed into someone stronger. Someone who understood that survival wasn't about avoiding responsibility. It was about carrying it honestly, openly, without letting the weight of it crush the person underneath. Emily set the rifle down gently in its case, the same case she'd carried onto that mountain ridge without a single soul in Bravo Company knowing what it truly contained. She thought about the words she'd spoken to her trainees just hours earlier. Words that had finally fully articulated a truth she'd spent 3 years struggling to understand. Precision was never about the trigger. It was about the responsibility behind it. And Emily Carter, soldier, survivor, mentor, the woman nobody had noticed until the moment an entire platoon's survival depended on exactly who she truly was, had finally learned to carry that responsibility, not as a burden that isolated her, but as a legacy she could pass forward to everyone who would come after. The silent girl nobody had noticed had become the soldier who changed an entire battle, not because she was the deadliest shot on that mountain, but because when everything fell apart, when hope had nearly run out, and when an entire platoon's survival came down to a single desperate question shouted across a collapsing battlefield, Emily Carter finally fully understood exactly why her answer mattered, and she never let fear silence that answer again.